what Al was saying, just from some kind of background essentially, for some kind of background. About 700 years ago, I became very passionately interested in learning about a number of things for reasons at the time I was. It wasn't so much that I had some logic or reason for an approach to research, but I was what you might call in those days a driven learner. And despite this enormous interest and passion in pouring through books and going to libraries and so forth and so on, I kept bumping into all kinds of obstacles, frustration. And at some point, what I realized was that how I was frustrated and why I was frustrated were my greatest learning opportunities. How I was being frustrated by my own learning strategies that I had kind of habituated to or tacitly accumulated. How I had been conditioned to relate to the organization of information in the outside world when I was trying to learn from it. There were many different things. I started to become a student of the obstacles of learning. And about this time, my son was born. Right here, picture of him in the background. And in the course of watching him evolve and given this process that I was going through and starting to connect up with dialogue partners and researchers in different communities in education, educational research, and learning science, and organizational science, starting to connect up into a larger dialogue matrix, I really started to become more and more persuaded that if an individual had a relationship between their own proprioceptive meaning needs, their own internal fluctuations of meaning, and the world they were learning from that was responsive to them at that meaning need level, they could learn anything. That in fact, that was how human beings seemed to be able to learn how to differentiate and extend themselves into being able to occupy and become masters of their physical self, to extend the range of their ability to hear, to understand language. It was a process of differentiation that the more that they could participate in it, the more that they could participate in learning to become a learner as opposed to become conditioned by knowledge. So over the course of this process, there's been people such as Al who have brought people from around the world with different kind of government, organizational, educational biases. There's been our own little sandbox, if you will, of 16 nieces and nephews under 5. My own son, I'm one of 8, and then all of them are having kids, and it's quite a pool of little children to watch. And then the real intimate relationship with Darren, and I'll explain some more of this as we go along. Before I go to the next step and talk about what I want to talk about from the standpoint of technology or learning or philosophy or dialogue or things that have been involved in here, organizational science, I'd like to tell a couple of stories that will act as a disclaimer about technology itself. I am not here to promote technology. This is what we're talking about today. We'll use technology to demonstrate the possibilities of a different kind of relationship between learners and the world they're learning from. But it's not about selling blocks. It's not about selling a particular piece of software. It's about learning to develop and evolve what we call a mutually learning-oriented relationship, an entirely different kind of systemic responsibility between the individual's learning process and the world that's facilitating learning. To make sure that we're clear that technology can't do this by itself, with a thought experiment that came to me 3 or 4 years ago, when I first started playing with it. And I envisioned a time, it doesn't matter how far we have to go into the future, when we all have this piece of technology that, because we've gotten through speech recognition, because we've busted through the membranes of speeds of communication and processing power and all of that, we have this device that connected to the world's databases and using distributed processing power from the world's databases as opposed to having to carry all the engines with us. We have a device that can display visual images that we can talk to, that can talk back to us, that can answer any question that we can pose that there is knowledge for, and that can crudely but dialogically tune into resolving what that question is with us. So that basically we can ask a crude question and tune into what we really need. This is a thought experiment. It doesn't exist. It may be quite a while before it does exist. But my point was, now what happens when I give this to a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old? Well, I mean, as I started to do that, I visualized that, well, one of the things that happens is they start, sticking it in orifices and digging in the ground and leaving it in the trash basket. And every once in a while, when they ask some question and the magic wand pops open and it's engaging for them. But in and of itself, a system that can respond to an inquiry doesn't necessarily imply that it can unfold a continuum of learning experiences in a way that is going to be helpful to that individual engaging in society, engaging in the world. So technology in itself, at that level, despite an increased degree of responsivity, all the power in the world, still implies that human beings need to regulate curriculum, some type of unfolding process through which learners become adept towards the world that they're in at the time. So that was a real helpful to me to realizing the limitations of technology. There is no end-all, be-all technology that's going to become the bubble we can learn in to become better human beings and more adaptive. And if AI gets to the point we can do that better than people, then it's probably going to be close. So, putting technology aside for a second, at least at that level, I'll tell you another story. There's an article that I'm reading back that I hope that you all take to read. This is published in the California School Board Journal. It's been previously published in other educational journals in the Brain Mind of that Science Bulletin. And the start of it was really a precious story to me and one that gives us some ground for the conversation about technology. I've been working on this project for 3 or 4 years, 5 years actually, and had gone from the philosophical inquiry and the phenomenological inquiry more and more into starting to manifest it technologically. I didn't know anything about computers. I learned about computers in order to build the environment that would prototype the kind of relationship I was concerned with. And as I was doing this, in parallel to doing this, one night I went out for a walk with my son, which is a pretty common practice for us, that we would go out at night when the world was quiet and kind of walk and fall into this and drop out of the world and drop into each other and in that sync be able to communicate with others. And this particular night, he says, "Dad, I've got this new invention. I want to share it with you." I said, "Okay." And what he had was this thing that looked like a it was made out of constructs, and everybody's got little kids, they understand what constructs, a little spider couplings with little arms and what have you. And at first we didn't think much about it. We went out for our walk together, and this whole thing was transparent for 20 or 30 minutes. And then all of a sudden, he saw this bug running across the concrete underneath the light at night. And he whipped this thing out and went down into what we call the curiosity craft, which is down in the field. And he took this thing as if it were Sherlock Holmes' magnifying glass, put it between himself and the bug, and started imitating this machine of the future that would, like a magnifying glass, begin to, like the pencil did in the previous experiment, show him the anatomy of the bug. So he was able to call up visuals, hear sounds. And he described it. He had this entire explanation for our work that sent this radar, and he called it a radar helper, into the whatever it was he pointed it at and collected information and came back and he was able to ask the question and make sounds. It was a multimedia magnifying glass came on with him without anything. He's 5 years old now. So this device, which he called the radar helper, he went on to later point at telephone poles and trees and stars, and it was a model for him. We had not talked about any of my work. We have a learning-oriented relationship, you might say. Whoa.